Shall we kick off, Simon?
Yep, let's go.
Look, welcome everyone for joining us at our masterclass, so-called, on AI for the C-suite. Simon and I are both partners at Best Practice AI, which brings our many years experience in digital and AI transformation to a mix of startups, corporate and investor clients. We do project management to make sure that projects work. We do strategy to help people understand how they should use AI. And increasingly, we're helping people with governance and regulatory questions around how you make sure that AI is used appropriately and handled in a way that works for all stakeholders. The aim today really is to give you a 360-degree sort of sweep through the questions around AI, very much targeted at people in the C-suite who are thinking through how can I use this, what works, what doesn't work. But also we often find this is a very useful conversation for people maybe in the AI world who work with leaders in big organizations, whether they're startups or they're data scientists, and help them understand how they can have a conversation with people in leading organizations, explaining what for many is still quite a complicated technology. So my name is Tim Gordon. My background is 20 plus years experience in digital transformation. I've done that everywhere from consulting firms to newspapers to politics to a whole series of different places. I'm a trustee for Full Fact, and I am a managing partner at Best Practice AI.
Good afternoon, pleasure to be here. My name is Simon Greenman. I have about 20 years of international digital transformation experience. I sit on the World Economic Forum's Global AI Council, and I've been involved in AI for quite some time, starting with a degree, and then early days of the internet helped start MapQuest, which was one of the first AI companies used for mapping. A lot of the work we do at Best Practice AI is around the questions of governance and how AI can help impact companies and society for the better. So we worked on the World Economic Forum's AI Empowering Leadership Board Toolkit. I've worked on the World Economic Forum's Model AI Governance Framework. So kicking off, what we're going to look at is AI and its promise. Now, most of you will know that, but as we know, there's a lot of hype associated with AI, with expectations that it will sort of change the world for good, as Jeff Bezos is saying here. But the counter to that with AI is there's a lot of the negative media headlines, narrative headlines around AI is going to steal our jobs, killer computers and the like. And it's hard to get a balance between the promises of how AI will improve the world for good and the negative side of it. But the first thing we'd like to say is, for all the talk of killer robots and the existential threat, the general intelligence where machines become more powerful than us and take over the world, ignore that. Let's focus on the practical applications and the reality of AI, which is more around narrow intelligence. And we put up this picture of a cucumber because it's an example of how a farmer in Japan is using AI to help automate the classification of cucumbers as it goes down the line. And that's the reality of AI, much more around practical use cases for very specific tasks. Now, AI is really machine learning has really taken off since 2012 and 13. And the latest incarnation of machine learning is really high-dimensional pattern matching, based on showing it large data sets to make predictions. If you wanted the machine learning to recognize a cat, you have to show it thousands of pictures of what a cat looks like. And if you want to differentiate from dogs, show it thousands of pictures of what a dog looks like. So the latest incarnation is really the machines will learn for themselves. And this contrasts quite heavily compared to the classical programming style. In the classical programming style, which we've had for many years, you show it the rules, if then do that, give it the data, and it will come up with the answer. The shift with machine learning and AI is you show it the data, picture of a cat and dog, tell it what the answers are. This is a cat, this is a dog, and it figures out the rules for itself. And this is the big shift that's gone on in AI. The challenge with this is it's very good at pattern recognition if it's seen the patterns before, but it lends itself to being quite brittle if it hasn't seen it. If you see this example of Tesla in auto-driving mode, it seems to be getting confused about this, what it considers a solid object, but is actually a puddle. And AI is very good when it's seen before, but not so good when it hasn't. So what we're seeing with AI today is it's being used widely and ubiquitously. AI is an enabler. It's a general purpose technology. It can be infused into many use cases ranging from HR to operations to marketing to sales. It is going to be ubiquitous. And we like to think of AI as really it replicates a lot of the senses and cognitive abilities we have. AI can help you see, hear, read, and analyze. It lets you interact directly with the real world. And one way to think about it is, what could you do if you had 1 million interns that were looking at documents, or 1 million interns that were looking at widgets coming down your production line? It really gives you this superpower capability. Or another way of thinking about it is, how could it increase the productivity of your top people by 100 times? And we'll come to examples of that shortly. So it allows, in short, AI in the workplace to offer scaled observation of the world. And we've seen this come out in the context of the past year and a half in COVID, where AI has been a leading tool here. And AI first helped the world identify COVID because it analyzed social media chatter coming out of Wuhan in late 2019, and it was able to identify this conversations going on about a novel virus, and it was about 3 or 4 companies that picked this up. AI has been a great tool to help diagnose symptoms from CT scans and provide triage to overwhelmed doctors. Think of thousands of cases or hundreds of cases of people showing COVID symptoms, take a diagnosis MRI scan. Doctors are in short supply. How about using AI to assess the scans and triage the most important patients? Therapeutics. AI has been used to help screen drug libraries to identify potential compounds, and the real success story has been on a global basis as how quickly we've been able to develop vaccines. And even in operations, AI used to drive robots to help clean hospitals, even interact with patients on a social basis. But another side of AI, and you can think about this in the work context, is how it's been particularly good for observation. When you've got millions of free interns, then you can start to think of it in the context of surveillance. We've seen AI used for thermal screening in stations and airports. You can see to automatically identify those temperatures. Similarly, with drones flying around, it's actually been used to identify people with fevers in the cloud. It's even being used to identify those who are wearing masks and not wearing masks. And finally, we've seen it being used to enforce social distancing. So here is a video with a heat map demonstrating when the AI thinks people are too close together and should be further apart in the context of maintaining social distance. So AI as a sort of scaled observation of the world, what it really allows us to do is has the potential to take unstructured information. If you think about your organizations, your businesses, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of messages that are unstructured going on. There's telephone calls going on. There's emails going on. There's chats on Zoom or Hopin. There's a huge amount of unstructured data that we really haven't had a chance to understand as management. But imagine if you could understand this wealth of conversations going on and be able to say, oh, this is what people are discussing. These are the issues that customers have. This is how productive our staff are. Now, this sort of scenario of surveillance, there's lots of obviously ethical, social, legal issues here, legal issues in the context of GDPR and being able to see people's data. But the power of AI to observe at scale is very much real. And we have to ask the question of whether or not this technology would be applied to understand what's going on in our workforce. And there are many companies today that are allowing vendors of AI that are allowing organizations to better understand what's going on. This is particularly important in the context of regulated industries such as financial services, where companies such as Reinfer on the left here are actually helping to understand what's going on in calls between companies and their customers in the context of the regulated financial services. So for example, trading, if a customer service is talking to a customer about trading shares, that is actually recorded, and you can better understand what's going on here. So overall, we see AI in the context as it's a general enabler that allows organizations to infuse this technology to improve processes across the organization. The best types of use cases, because there's hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of use cases for AI, is those use cases that are very discrete tasks, number one. They're repetitive tasks that we're doing frequently, number two. So for example, if you're observing quality control of parts coming down a manufacturing line, that's a discrete task and repetitive, very similar in nature. They don't vary much. One of the reasons that RPA, robotic process automation, has taken off is because it's a very repetitive task where staff are having to do data entry in a very structured, routine way. Opportunities, number four, just the use case of opportunities to offer greater efficiency. We've seen a lot of AI being used to help improve the productivity of hiring when you have to ask the same questions time and time again to a very large candidate pool, especially in the hospitality and services space. Can we automate that and create efficiency? We see use cases really focusing on prediction, optimization, and pattern recognition. For example, predicting customer churn. And there's very clear, number six, inputs and outputs, and number seven has lots of data to learn from. And we find that these use cases, these characteristics and dimensions really define use cases that are very well suited to implementation through AI. And obviously, this is a big subject. We're not going to have time to go through it, but if you email us or put your message in the chat here, we'll be very happy to have slides to you and talk to you afterwards. At Best Practice AI, if you would like further information about use cases, we also do publish for free one of the world's largest libraries of use cases and case studies. So feel free to go there and take a look at how AI can be done. So if you're interested in marketing, just type in marketing search and it'll bring up use cases and case studies here. So Tim, how should we think about the strategic and financial case for AI?
So the heart of AI is this slightly strange conundrum, which if you look at the macro level and any macro prediction you see from any bank or Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey or Deloitte will all tell you that there is a massive macro value creation story coming out of AI. And it's, the example we got here of Gartner Research talked about a 3.9 trillion opportunity by 2022. That number may be a bit out of date, but the pattern of people making big predictions is pretty consistently clear. The challenge is that on the micro side, we're seeing lots of businesses really struggling to actually get ROI from their projects. So there's a survey done by, I think, Boston Consulting Group a few years ago that basically said 7 out of 10 executives who've been working with AI were struggling to see the ROI from the project. So how do we combine this macro huge story that's going to change the world and this micro story of actually it's really hard to make this happen? Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The first, next slide please, is that fundamentally AI is actually very hard to do. Not so much the AI itself. AI increasingly is something where the tools are being pretty consistently used across the globe. There's a lot of talent involved in it. People like Amazon and so on are providing more and more of those tools for free. But the challenge is to actually get to a place where you're ready to do AI. And the reason for that is, think about the iceberg on the previous page, AI is only the tip of the iceberg. And actually to make AI work, what needs to happen is all the underlying plumbing, the data processes, the business plans, that's got to be laid out and made ready. And to get that right is actually pretty hard and pretty expensive and often quite a lot of boring drudge work before you can get to the really exciting AI stuff. And so what we're seeing is lots of companies and organizations that are stuck in the proof of concept trap, where they can get a proof of concept working, something that's kind of nice and cool. That might take a few months, but actually to get that to a place where it's ready to go into production and ready to go into a place where the entire organization can use it sustainably is a lot harder because you need to change all the underlying processes. And by the way, with some of the startups we've seen, that's also a problem, which is you can get it there, you can do a proof of concept, but to get the organization to buy the product for the long term is a real struggle because of these underlying challenges and underlying issues. Now, the companies who are really making this work and obviously are using AI to power unbelievably large market capitalizations are organizations which have digital and data plumbing at their heart. So you think of all the sort of the big US digital platforms with the Googles, the Facebooks, and so on. They all very much have built organizations where the data flow is the heart of what they do, and the AI then adds that extra 10%, 20% fine tuning and improvement on top to really get to the same sort of place. And anyone who's worked with the maybe the more legacy competitors will know that a lot of their underlying digital platforms are a spaghetti junction that make it hard to make things work. And I think one of the big examples of this is Ant Financial, which has basically gone from being a small part of the bigger Chinese corporate to being one of the most valuable companies in the world, slightly facing some political problems now, but the underlying ability to use AI to optimize what they're doing, and with a staff of 10,000 have a valuation that's worth many times some of these big US banks that might have several 100,000 staff working for them. Now, the reason why this works is that these corporates effectively use AI flywheel economics. And what drives the AI flywheel economics, Simon, is that you have Simon, can we go to the next? Thank you. It is that effectively these organizations have got more data, and with more data, they can do more learning. So fundamentally, they can build a better product. And when you've got a better product, clearly that is more attractive and you get more customers, and more customers will end up giving you more data as well. And so you've got this flywheel flowing through the process that basically means returns to these corporates is very powerful. They then attract more talent, they get more capital, and they find themselves in a really strong competitive position. One, I think, of the challenges going forward in this space is that this is precisely the sort of scenario that tends towards monopolies. And whilst at the moment you've got the Googles and so on who are in the place where they deliver these monopolies, as AI increasingly moves into other sectors of the economy, you begin to see that will cause new potential risks. Now, one of the things that's very powerful about AI platform companies is that they break the traditional proposition trade-off that most organizations have had to make in the 20th century, at least, between speed, scale, and scope. So what do I mean by this? Scope, firstly, is personalization. Think of your personal butler who will deliver for you something very precise that is targeted entirely at you. Then the speed, which is the second thing. So think of Coke. Coke basically marketed itself as within arm's reach of desire. You could get Coke anywhere in the world almost immediately because they built that speed and availability. And finally, scale. Scale is what essentially allows you to drive price down because you're offering stuff at scale. So you bring that mix of personalization, immediate availability, and price. And historically, organizations, a boutique hotel, Coke, Ford, have had to choose between those three. If you think about Amazon, Amazon offers all three of those things. And that's fundamentally why AI companies have a massive competitive advantage when it comes to going out there and offering propositions to consumers. Now, to deliver this requires an AI factory. So the heart of a future AI first organization has to very much be driven around making sure that data pipeline is processed. I've taken this, by the way, from a really good book, Competing the Age of AI, by a couple of Harvard business professors, which is well worth a look. But effectively, this brings out very clearly the need to have this sort of process at the heart of an organization, which is very different from a traditional organization that may well have a production facility at the heart of it in the real world. This, if you like, is a digital factory producing things. Now, all of this creates what, for most corporate executives, shareholders, and chief executives, is a real challenge, which is if you're trying to transform an organization, the investment you might make, and perhaps the next screen, Simon, if the investments you're trying to make, there's always going to be something that's important. There's always an urgent investment you can make. So you can always spend a bit more money now on marketing. You can always spend a bit more money now on some product improvement. You can always spend a bit more money now on something that's going to help you meet your quarterly or annual results. And the sort of really kind of fundamentally quite boring to many people underlying digital plumbing transformation is consistently will fall down the investment schedule because it's hard work, it takes time, it costs money, and it's not going to give you that quarterly or even that annual return. However, the later you leave it, the harder and harder it gets to compete, because at some stage, somebody is making that investment, or they're a startup making that investment from the get-go, and they will just overtake you. And for a long time, that investment is zero return, but effectively it's a fixed cost. So when you hit it, suddenly things can take off. And so we're seeing a lot of challenge for legacy companies to make that move into the new world. And both Simon and I have worked with a lot of companies trying to make that jump, and it's a really, really hard strategic jump to make, but it's a key one to compete in the age of AI.
Thanks, Tim. So we talked about the strategic financial context for AI and the importance of really thinking about how it can transform your business and the underlying plumbing that needs to be put in place to actually realize the benefits of AI here. The next question that we see asked increasingly by the C-suite is, how do you actually operationalize AI? How do you scale it, and how do you actually deliver the value? One of the things that is very clear about AI is there's a lot of experimentation going on, a lot of proof of concepts going on, but how many companies have actually been able to take those experiments and move AI into production at scale and realize the benefits? And what we've seen increasingly is it's very easy to do an experiment in AI. In fact, there's so much AI technology and frameworks available for free, and they're relatively straightforward to put together. You could actually get probably a smart 17-year-old with a bit of computer science and Python, download a machine learning framework, and actually get AI machine learning up and running in a couple of hours, if that. But the challenge is to do it at scale. So what we've seen is 6 dimensions that are important here. And first of all, it's having a plan for AI. What is it that's actually wanting to be achieved here? And putting AI in a business context. AI isn't technology for its own sake. AI is because it can realize business benefit in terms of improved customer service, improved efficiency, improved revenue driving. So number one, having the right plan. Number two, the people side of AI is critical here. What we've seen is AI is often sort of hidden and in the IT department where it's a bit of a sandbox experiment. But no, AI, we increasingly believe, because of its strategic nature, needs to be an executive level, a board level issue. It needs to be very much cross-functional. It needs to be collaborative between technology and the business functions, marketing with technology and data science. Number three, data, and we'll spend a bit more time on this, is absolutely critical. And what we actually see is organizations can spend as much as 70 to 80% of their time getting the data, making sure the data is quality, labeling the data before they even get going in AI. And so this area is frequently underinvested. Then obviously technology, how do you integrate it into your technology stack? How do you get AI technology? Do you build versus buy? Then how do you scale it up? What we often find is AI works in experiment, but when you bring it into the real world, it's not as robust. And you have to think about how you interface between the AI technology and the humans. So we often look at questions, do you put humans in the loop, over the loop, or do you fully automate the decision? And then number 6, and we'll talk about this more in a bit, is the risk dimensions of AI. There are operational risks, legal risks, and obviously the media portrays the issues of ethics and bias and the like. And I'll talk to just one case study that we've been working on recently, which hopefully will bring these 6 dimensions to life. There's a company in the US, it's a startup called OR Intelligence, which is focused on bringing smarts to the surgical processes in the operating theater. And if in the operating theater, if you're going in for a surgery, if you're having a traumatic injury where you've broken your leg and you need to have a plate attached or a hip replacement, before surgery, the hospital needs to make sure that it has the right tray with the right instruments and implants. And often you find that that's not delivered to the operating theater in time. And what will happen is if surgery is delayed, especially in the US, the financial cost of that is absolutely huge. Some people estimate that a 1 hour delayed surgery can be $10,000 to $25,000 of impact. And obviously that has clinical impact on the patients as well. So can AI be used to help make sure the right trays, instruments, and implants are available to the surgeons when they need it for surgery? So we looked at whether or not computer vision, a simple mobile app, an iPhone app, as an example, could be used to scan the trays to say, yes, it's got the right screwdriver, no, it's missing screws, yes, it has the right forceps. Can computer vision be used for classifying and making sure it has the right inventory? Now, the key challenge in all of this is machine learning, AI, requires lots and lots of data to be able to learn. So in this case, the trays of items and instruments, how could we get tens of thousands of photos, basically, of different trays in different lighting conditions, in different angles, in different configurations. Sometimes the items in the tray at this angle, this angle. In fact, the number of combinations here of lighting, angles, configurations of item in the trays is almost exponential into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands examples. Now, one way of doing this is you could go around and take lots of photos, but obviously that would be very time consuming. So what we did here on this project is we created synthetic worlds, almost like creating game worlds. And we created tens of thousands of synthetic images of trays with items in at different angles. And this is some of the examples here. But it's not only creating lots of images, you have to label these images. This is a screwdriver. This is a forceps, and so on. So the picture on the right here shows how some of the images were absolutely, images were actually available. And then we created lots of synthetic images to go with this that were then used to feed into the machine learning. And this was photosynthetic, the machine learning model. And coming out of this, a world-first tray and instrument computer vision classifier system. All right, so that was what we did on the project here. But what it shows is, in terms of the key dimensions of what we need to do to make AI work, is make sure we have the data available, make sure the data is labeled. And this recent AI survey from O'Reilly showed the importance across organizations of having the right data, it's the right quality and labeled. So overall, we then need to look at the technology, which is how do we get the technology for AI? And there's a lot of talk about getting the skills here. But what we decided to do in this project is we didn't have the in-house skills to do this, so we outsourced to a group of PhD computer vision specialists who had had a lot of experience in being able to build synthetic worlds. We also found that there was a lot of technology that was being used, that is available for use off of the shelf as well. And in this case, we were using some technology from Facebook that's available freely and widely. Now, what's most interesting about AI, I think, is its forecastability. Now, all of you have obviously got technology in your department. You've got applications, you've got CRM, you're probably using SurveyMonkey and a whole series of SaaS tools. What's very clear is these types of traditional software tools are very predictable in terms of how long it would take to get up and running. So this type of application would take 3 months, 6 months, that sort of thing. The challenge that we find with AI, and many organizations find, that it's unpredictable. How well will the technology and models work? How well will the computer vision work? What's the right algorithms to use here? And so the word data science and experimentation is right, because you're building models, and there's often a lack of clarity as you go in, and predictability, how long it would take and how well it will work. And that's a key dimension to AI, is how do you get greater predictability and forecastability? And then finally, number 5 is in how you actually operationalize this, is how do you scale computer vision and ensure its robustness for the real world? Is the computer vision here going to work in the operating theater? How do we scale up the data processes to deal with not one tray, but thousands of trays and tens of thousands of instruments? And then how do we put a human in the loop when the computer vision doesn't actually recognize the surgical instrument? Is there a human there to actually help with the classification of those instruments? So overall, we see these 6 areas: plan, people, data, technology, operationalization, and then risk as being the key dimensions that need to be aligned to make AI scale in the real world. So we're going to finish up on the question of risk here. And so I'll hand it over to you, Tim.
Great, thanks, Simon. And just as we go through, if people have questions, please don't hesitate to drop them into the chat. And sort of our view is any questions are valid questions. So please do feel free to put in questions or thoughts there, and we'll try and cover those as we go forward. There's a lot of talk about the risks of AI. And I think if you think about the types of problems we face, there are three broad buckets. Firstly, clearly, is when AI is poorly implemented or something goes wrong with how the technology is used. So whether that's a self-driving into a bicyclist because it's not being used properly. There's a whole series of challenges we see where essentially people are just not using technology very well, and that can cause problems. The second, perhaps bigger, but also more interesting question is around the data that goes into AI. So AI clearly is based on data that comes from ultimately the real world, and the choices of data you put in or the ways in which data is measured and gathered can be profoundly very mixed. Now, the most high-profile examples of this clearly are things around, for example, ethnicity or gender, where we've had some pretty horrendous examples of deployment of AI, which probably most of this audience will be aware of, where clearly we can see things not working very well, and that's a real challenge. But clearly, so getting your data right and making that happen going forward is a really key part of getting AI right, which goes back to the earlier comments we were making about the size of the plumbing and so on. And the third question of AI that comes out, I think we also covered briefly, is around some of those new business model questions that emerge. So whether it's the fact that people will increasingly be under very close surveillance, whether it's the personalization world where effectively you create these echo chambers and people end up sort of in getting very specific targeted messages, or whether it's a trade-off around privacy, where fundamentally the more information we can share with some of these systems, the better the outcomes. So, for example, the more healthcare information and lifestyle information I can share with a healthcare app, the better the outcome will be. But clearly there is a privacy trade-off there, which may well operate differently in different markets. So it is, for example, a major issue in European markets. It is probably less of an issue in the Chinese market. But these are quite big sort of questions that emerge. This mix of these three buckets end up leading for the C-suite to three main areas to really think about them. They're clearly strategic. The mix of entrants will change. You'll need to change your business proposition. There are questions around the sustainability of what you're doing. This obviously plays through also into some of the environmental questions around how you're making sure things work properly. And the second mix of questions are operational. How do you change your decision making? How do you do customer service? What's your quality control? How are you making sure that security is there? The entire new vector around cyber attacks is being given absolute rocket pace with AI, and how you make sure you get that right. Auditability, how do you help people understand what's going on? We'll talk a bit more about that later. And safety, how do you make sure that your new technology-enabled tool is not doing bad things to people, whether in the real world or in the online world. And finally, legal and ethical. There's issues around bias, we mentioned, regulation, how do you protect your IP, data privacy, product liability, and competition. And these have real brand reputational issues and therefore real financial issues. And we can see that actually, next slide maybe, a lot of these failures can be quite high profile. So if you think about a lot of the ways, next slide please, a lot of the ways in which people currently talk about ethics, they're almost being put through the mirror of AI ethics. And when it goes wrong, things are seen as being pretty high profile. So for example, a lot of the issues around race and policing, a lot of that is being articulated through questions around how we're using image recognition and cameras, and it's therefore become a fulcrum for a lot of those debates. Now, clearly the world is thinking a lot about this. And if we think about the number of AI ethical frameworks or AI regulatory frameworks that are emerging, there are between 200 and 300, possibly more. Everyone from the OECD, the Singapore government, a series of great organizations like the IEEE, also various corporates are coming up with things. What you can see there is that across all of those various frameworks, broadly, there are 6 themes that keep emerging and remain very strong. Firstly, the importance of explainable and transparent decision-making. This is really critical that we, as much as possible, lift open the black box and explain to people as far as possible what's going on. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Secondly, that what's been created is inclusive, diverse, and fair. So really making sure that people, and this goes to sort of the teams who are working on this, there's education around this, that also that you're trying to make sure that your AI team, the teams working on this, are as diverse as possible. So you don't just have the viewpoints of one particular group of people or one particular social dynamic, sort of really thinking about how things work and adding those constant questions of how do we get there. Third, they've all got to be built and tested for safety. Safety is absolutely critical. There are lots of debates around whether you have humans in the loop or not in the loop, but fundamentally, if you're making big decisions, you need humans in the loop, and that is where the regulation, at least in Europe, is very clearly going. It's got to be socially beneficial. It's got to respect human rights and the law. And finally, and really critical, people are accountable. And that, if you're a C-suite executive, means at some stage you will be accountable for what's happening here. And it's kind of important that clarity inside the organization around how you're making decision and how things are working is built through into the process. Now, beyond these frameworks, we've also begun to see regulation. And actually, there is already AI regulation under GDPR. And GDPR states that you need explainability clear so that if you're making decisions around people, humans have the right to understand what's happening. Now, I think one of the potential upsides of AI and some of these questions, these sort of ethical questions in AI, is the mirror it will create to the world. So there is a large US tech corporate who spent a long time struggling to get their recruitment algorithm right. And it consistently sort of ended up giving more points to men, typically white men, but also I think sort of East Asian men, and giving them better scores. So, for example, the captain, if you've been captain of the male volleyball team, you got a higher score if you've been captain of the women's volleyball team. And they did all sorts of clever things to change the algorithm around. But fundamentally, what it emerges, it's clear, is the historical data reflects historical hiring practices of that company. And so really understanding and getting transparency around these things will both help the AI, but we also hope will help actually create those companies, those organizations willing to have that transparent conversation to help make them be better organizations and making better decisions as well. Now, looking forward, more AI regulation is coming. The EU just a couple of months ago now have put out their proposed EU legal framework. It's obviously not yet in place. It's the start of a process. I think the deadline for feedback is August the 6th. So I would encourage everyone on this call to get involved in that conversation. But they're clearly setting out a need to limit AI and drawing out some whole series of high-risk AI use cases that may well actually incur some pretty strong governance, which I think is a really positive outlook going forward. But the thing that we keep coming back to in this space, and this is really critical, is that trust essentially is absolutely the heart of the AI challenge. AI gives us an amazing ability to transform the world, but if people don't trust it, all of the issues are going to get tougher and tougher. If you think about trust as a way to create value, it's really important to understand that this actually creates economic value. It's not just a nice thing to have, but the economic value it creates across all stakeholders is really critical. So whether your customers will be more willing to share, you need data to build AI-enabled propositions. If customers trust you, they will be more willing to share the data and you won't need to pay them for it, and they're less likely to tell you fibs about stuff in the data. So fundamentally, it'll help you get a cheaper input factor, which is your customer data. If your suppliers trust you, they'll be willing to share data things with you. So if you think about your supply chain as an interlocked ecosystem, the more information you've got going through that ecosystem, the more able you will be to run that efficiently and effectively. But if you're in a situation where the suppliers just think you'll use that to beat them up on cost, you'll struggle to get a win. So really, that trust for suppliers is critical. For staff, it's, we've talked before about some of the surveillance issues. If you ask a room full of senior executives, do you think if you understood all the emails and communication in your company, you could, reduce costs or reduce friction by 20%? They all say yes. If you ask them, would you be willing to have the organization look at your emails? There's a silence. And what you can see is that trust, therefore, is critical to get that into the right sort of place. Now, some of this is how you use tools and how some of the new ways of engineering around federated learning and so on will enable you to be careful on this. But at the heart of it comes down to, how do you behave as an organization? And if people trust executives in, for example, how they handle people through the COVID crisis, they're more likely to trust you when it comes to rolling out AI and doing clever things with AI. Regulators are going to get more and more involved. If you listen to senior regulators on the lessons they've learned from previous generations of tech regulation, I think they all understand that what happened was they came to the game often quite late. And by the time they started worrying about Facebook and Google, to some extent, the horse had bolted and the barn door was wide open. And so they are increasingly getting involved at an earlier and earlier stage. So building out that trust-based conversation is really critical. And finally, society, the media are watching this closely now, and you need to absolutely get this right. So one of the things that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment now is explainability statements, which is work that is being used to try and help people understand how you can take this forward. Now, explainability is the cornerstone of trust and good AI governance. If you're transparent, you can explain what's going on. That's a really critical thing. And we need, obviously, to trade off between the ability of your tool to sort of be at cutting edge and be as precise as possible, and the accuracy of explainability. So you've got some models you can infer about decision trees and so on, but deep neural networks are harder to understand because of the way they're structured and the way they create their data sets. And so it's often hard to understand how these deep neural networks will work. You can have some of the the open AI ones or the Google ones that are coming out now might have 1.6 trillion parameters. That's incredibly hard for people to understand. So building an explainability statement that basically explains to people why you're using AI, how you're using AI, and how you take AI forward is something that we're doing at the moment with a bunch of quite high-profile AI companies, and we're very keen to find other people who want to work with us, because this is a space where there's a lot of room to be done for continuing to build out some of the explainability options. And we've got a special session on that this Wednesday, an open roundtable, which as part of the GLS forums, which you'll be very welcome to come and join, which will go into some more detail around how actually we can make this work. Now, I'm very keen that we get questions from people as much as possible. So please, we've talked non-stop at you for 40 minutes now, and we're very keen that we open this up as much as possible to questions. Now, Barb Hyman from Australia had a great question around how you make sure that the HR team think about using AI. So her question is, we work in AI for people decisions, ROI from HR pressures not often measured, which makes creating the business case more challenging. A lot of fear mythology about AI, how to build the AI literacy of HR leaders. And I think that's a great question, because there's a whole series of companies working in the space. I mean, Harvey is probably one of the most high profile examples of people who are using AI to run a lot more people through the lot more recruitment through the process. And I think the key thing to think on here is that one thing is that to make the AI work in this space, you have to really get the data structured in an appropriate way. And so HR decisions, it's fair to say, are not always the most transparent of decisions. But if you're running a proper use of AI in this space, you have to make sure that people understand that you're asking everyone standardized questions, which already reduces one form of bias, that they're being asked in a structured way that can then play back into building a tool that can measure competencies and reduce bias in the space. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually take what's often quite a sort of complex world, and you go back not too long, and it was often quite a questionable world, but a world where actually you can ask structured questions, you can therefore measure things pretty openly, and you've got the data afterwards to go through and say, are we meeting appropriate criteria to support people to get to the right sort of place. Now, I think the HR question is a really interesting one, because there's a lot of people who are quite concerned when AI is used, because they're worried about losing their jobs, they're worried about the impact it might have, and there's a lot of sort of hype talked about that sort of stuff. Our view is that actually organizations that don't embrace AI are more likely, your job is more likely to be at risk, because fundamentally they're less likely to be able to compete economically. But we do think the other key thing here is really making sure that as much as possible, organizations think about educating people all through the organization, and a lot of tools are available very cheaply to make sure that people understand both the opportunity for AI, some of the risks, but also help them be always ready for the next role, which increasingly is going to require these data skills.
Yeah, and to add to that, there's a lot of use cases for AI, machine learning, human resources. If you think of AI as a prediction tool, can it help you predict which will be the best candidates? And can it help you automate interviewing candidates? Also, things like we're seeing a lot of chatbots used so that HR can better serve a wide organization, answer Q&A and things like that. But as Tim says, I mean, the key to all of this is having the foundations of data. And particularly when you look at HR, the use of AI in HR for tasks such as recruiting or deciding who gets promotion or some level of grading of employee performance. There's a lot of questions that arise relative to bias, and there's also a lot of legal questions, particularly in the States, around making sure you're not discriminating against protected classes, age, gender, ethnicity, and things like that. But we see that fundamentally, if you get this right, then you can bring a lot of benefits to the HR field through the use of AI and machine learning.
There's probably fair to say, I think you would always want a human in the loop, is you never want the final decision to be taken by a machine. I think that's kind of the place where this has gone wrong, is where machines have been seen to take the final decision. Indeed, there was a court case in the Netherlands a couple of months ago against Uber and Ola, where the courts reinforced that you always need a human in the loop when you're making those decisions. And hopefully the data you need for AI will also increase the transparency and the consistency of the decisions that those humans are making. So the AI and the humans working together would hopefully deliver a better result. Okay, yeah. Question from Mahash here. How do you get vendors to open up how the AI works in procurement governance context? Simon?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of, it's a great question. There's a lot of procurement frameworks out there. And in particular in the UK, you see that the British government is a pioneer relative to making sure AI procurement follows a set of rules. So basically, and there's one of the things that we actually worked on was the World Economic Forum's procurement guidelines for vendors. But basically, what you can do is put in place a set of checklist questions that you will demand of your vendors, and it goes through things like, first of all, explainability. Your vendors need to explain how their AI works. You need to ask of your vendors, how do they ensure that it's not biased or unfair? How do they make sure that it's robust and secure? So you basically go through a lot of the principles of making sure it's not biased, fair, and secure. And so I mean, we're happy, drop us an email and we can share some of those procurement frameworks with you. But the reality is, as Tim talked about earlier, it's a really important question because AI is considered a black box and because it's complex. If you procure AI technologies, you've got to make sure you're not running the risk of reputational and legal damage. So it's a very important point.
Cool. A question here from Samir Sharma. I think the data, or comment more, I think the data commons or the data dividend will be interesting when it starts to put control back into the hands of the people. Simon, any comments on that?
I'll let you want to.
I think it depends.
Yeah,
sorry, Sam.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it depends a lot on the area. And I think when particularly seeing, for example, in the UK at the moment with debates around NHS data, the key thing here is that there are a series of tools that are being used and governance procedures that are being thought through. And there's some really great work happening at places like the Turing and related organizations, thinking through how you can get data governance stuff to work better. And I think increasingly some of the technology being used around, for example, federated learning and so on, will mean that we can get to a place where privacy is more better protected and we can get to a better place on this. Okay, what applications do you think blockchain-based technologies would have for AI, and would it be possible to one day manage organizations using DAOs? I know nothing about, very limited about blockchain. Any comment on that, Simon?
I'm not my favorite subject, but the reality is blockchain falls into the spectrum of AI as well. It's an enabling technology, so there's a lot of cases to actually come out of it. Obviously, with blockchain, it's about immutable ledgers over time of transactions, being able to trace transactions. This almost becomes data for AI, and so there's lots of applications that you can build from AI on top of all of that blockchain data. And so, really, in some respects, it's imagination that can go wild on what you can do with AI and blockchain.
Cool.
What else have we got?
AI risk literacy is really important. Isn't there too much focus on explainability and getting models into production and ML ops? Actually, I'm not sure it's an either or. I think people need to understand the AI risk literacy. I think that the people also need to be, remain focused on actually making sure that stuff happens. And I think there are various organizations I have seen where some of the AI risks are almost used as an excuse not to go forward in terms of making stuff happen. Now, there are places where that is entirely appropriate. And we all can think of examples of machine learning tools that have been used that frankly shouldn't have been used and should be held back. But equally, there can be an element of risk around people, not moving forward on some of these areas. So I think it's a constant balance. And I think the challenge for governance at the C-suite is how do you balance off against, pushing forward projects and giving them the support they need so that they don't run into the ground in internal, complexity and sort of interdepartmental wrangles and other sort of business challenges in an organization. But at the same time, you don't have people going off and sort of in a little box on their own, creating things that actually are kind of worrying for the organization. So one of the things that we see consistently is that if you think about how you deploy this inside a big organization, you need a business lead on this. So you need someone who has got the sort of the broader view around how things work, working with obviously the best sort of digital and data and ML talent you can afford, but making sure that you then bring in all the key stakeholders, ideally external as well as internal, to really make sure that you're building a tool that's got both the legs, but also is watching out for the risk. And that's the key part of AI governance. Now, we've got a session tomorrow, I'll signal to you all, on AI governance. We're doing that with some with some of our partners at Simmons & Simmons and Jacob Turner, who's written the book, if you like, on AI and law. And that would be a really great chance to go into more detail on some of these things.
And to add to that, I mean, it's not it's as Tim says, it's not an either or. Explainability is the cornerstone of trust. It's going to be a legal requirement. If you're working with your customers, they're going to demand it. You will need explainability. But the second side of it, DevOps, is all about how do you actually move AI models into production and scale them up. And there will be legal requirements around traceability, auditability, making sure you've got to make sure you have the right model and the right version in production. You know, if you get the wrong model in production and it's making trading predictions in real time, you know, the implications are tens, hundreds of millions. So it's not an either or. If you are interested in this topic, come back to us. We actually work very closely with a company called Selden that's a leader in DevOps and DevOps space. What's next, Tim? We've got about...
Quick question from Gopal. Should trustworthy AI be part of a broader conversation around the trustworthiness of the business? I think totally. I think I mentioned earlier, to some extent, AI ethics has become almost the way in which we talk about business ethics at the moment. So there's a clear link there. Richard Frawley, I've studied the recent Crunchbase top 100. There is a lot of tech, but it's hard to see the pathway to commercialization despite the money being thrown at them. Further digging into Crunchbase also showing revenues are still light. Comments? Simon, you literally read the blog post on this.
Yeah, there's multiple types of AI companies. I mean, there's whole platform tools, technology, picks and shovels of the gold rush companies. And the reality is a lot of the race for providing the best picks and shovels is being played out between the big tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. Who's got the best picks and shovels? So, you know, the race is really between the monopoly technology giants versus the startup companies. The startup companies, there is a big market, but they've got to very much choose a specific positioning in this space so they don't compete head on with Google. But a lot of what you've got to really understand is a lot of companies that are starting up are specific applied AI applications, HR companies, operations companies powered by AI. They've got very clear use case and very clear value. So we think applied AI companies will, frankly, are going to be the future, and they will be very dominant in their category. So, but, you know, like any gold rush and any paradigm change, you're going to see a lot of startup companies fall by the wayside. Next.
Just quickly, Richard, my view on the dark secret of the AI world is that essentially this is a real estate play, which is the people making the money are the AWSs and the people moving everyone onto cloud. And fundamentally, this is a huge cloud play, and there's billions in that. And a lot of the AI is being used to excite people and get people to make that bigger commercial spend. And that's where a lot of the money is at the moment. But that's also what's going to provide a lot of the capital to make sure this thing does happen. So don't just look at the AI world itself, look at some of the businesses around it as well. Okay, Samir, you mentioned a business lead who drives AI ML in the C-suite. Who would that be, i.e. Chief Data Officer, Chief Data Analytics Officer, or other?
Yeah, fantastic question. And we see it vary depending upon the size of the organization. In all honesty, it doesn't matter the exact title. What matters is they have seniority. They would generally be in the executive committee or near the executive committee, and the CEO at the end of the day is putting their stamp of authority behind it. So we've seen it all across. Some organizations really big are hiring a new chief AI officer. Sometimes it's coming out of the IT department. Sometimes it's coming out of digital transformation department. But it's really the most important thing is visibility and power behind this person.
Great. So I think we're running out of time now. So can you just move the next two slides through? The next slide very quickly is a series of books that we think are well worth or texts we think are well worth a read. So the work we've done at the World Economic Forum around the board agenda, if you're interested in that space, is well worth looking at. And just to sort of note, we're doing a further session later today covering some of the same topics, but very much the focus on how the board should think about AI. And this is based on our work at the World Economic Forum. So if you have any board members who you think need to think about AI, then please get them along to that session. I think it's at 4 o'clock today. Prediction Machines, it's not perhaps quite the publicity it deserves, but we think it's a brilliant book in terms of really thinking through the economics of AI and sort of arguing in terms of how this stuff works. Competitive Challenge, I mentioned that before. That's a great one as well. And final slide, look, we've got our contact details here. please do get in touch with us. We're always willing to talk things through. We'd love to learn more about what you're up to. We work, as I said before, with corporates, with startups, and with investors, and we're very open to just a broad conversation around AI with a special focus on governance and explainability going forward. So we've got a session this afternoon on the board. Do bring any board members to that. Tomorrow we're doing as I say, a joint session with our legal comrades in the world of how you make AI governance work. And then on Wednesday, we're doing a very focused roundtable where we want voices to talk as much as us, really, as opposed to us talking at the audience on explainability statements to how we take those forward, because that clearly is, if you like, one of the fastest ways you can take AI governance and all these AI thoughts and really begin to make them work. And there's a question on that, which I think we'll try and answer. How can the truth flow not just a gimmick? Do come along tomorrow and ideally Wednesday, and we'll talk all that through in some detail. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you're all enjoying the sun wherever you are. Thank you.